Welcome back to Environmental Ethics. I'm Tom, and this video is discussing the topic of what is environmental ethics. In the last video, we talked about the topic of what is ethics, and we talked about how ethics has to do with ought statements, which can be thought of as rules of conduct. And when we're talking about ethics, we're talking about rules of conduct for being a good person or being a good human being, doing the right thing in some kind of overarching absolute sense, right? A higher kind of sense of human conduct. One other way to think about ought statements is to think about them as articulating obligations, right? Obligations we have to other people. When we talked about the example of one ought not steal, that might be cast as an obligation one has to others, or maybe an obligation one has to oneself, right? When we think about things like integrity, right? Living up to the principles that one endorses, right? So, and when we think about obligations, this turns us towards the issue of environmental ethics. The main overarching issue underlying environmental ethics is how and whether we can extend our ethical obligations to nature, right? And the question is, do we really have ethical obligations to nature itself, or is it really just a version or an expression of our ethical obligations to other individuals, right? So an example I like to use for this is to imagine that I bought myself a cashmere sweater, right? Cashmere sweaters are very expensive, and it's a very fine material. When I bought this, I have this kind of obligation to take care of it. It's a very, very expensive piece of clothing, and so I probably shouldn't treat it like I would treat all my other t-shirts and stuff like this, right? I need to be careful about how I wash it, how I dry it, make sure it doesn't get stained. Now, looking at that example, one may think that I have some kind of obligation to the sweater, right? I have an obligation to take care of the sweater. But upon further reflection, I think we would recognize that I don't really have any kind of moral obligation to the sweater itself, right? My moral obligation is really to myself and to the people around me, right? So treating the sweater poorly is to disregard my own financial situation. Maybe if my finances are tied up with other people, I live with other people or whatever, my disregard spending a ton of money on something like cashmere sweater and then just ruining it within a couple of days would be very disrespectful. Maybe it has to do with my not having an appreciation or respect for people's property or my own property, this kind of stuff. And so really my obligation to take care of that sweater is really an obligation that I have to myself and my own integrity, and then my obligations to other people in my life. The question of environmental ethics is whether or not the environment, whether or not nature, is like the sweater. If we think nature is like the sweater, this is to say that nature has merely instrumental value. That means that its value derives only from our interests and needs, right? And so there's no doubt that nature has instrumental value. We use natural resources, we recreate in nature, we like to go camping and traveling and hiking and swimming in the ocean and so on and so forth, right? And then we use water and oil and coal and all kinds of minerals to make all kinds of things, right? And so that's instrumental value. We have needs and interests, and we can use that to meet those needs and interests. But the question is whether or not that's kind of where it bottoms out for the environment. Another answer is to say that the environment is not like the sweater, right? Nature is more robust than the sweater in the sense that it has value in and of itself. This is to say that nature has inherent value, or sometimes intrinsic value, right? That means to say that a mountain or a tree is deserving of respect or care or something in and of itself. And this is to say that we have a moral obligation to preserve that particular piece of nature. And so this is irrespective of our plans. So maybe preserving a bunch of trees or forest runs counter to our interests. If you think that that forest has inherent value, then you think that we have a duty, right, to preserve that forest, even if it runs counter to what we want to do. The paper we read for this module is a paper by a guy named Elliott Sober, and he talks about various problems for environmentalism. And so he's talking about various obstacles to trying to understand how we could have ethical obligations to the environment. A few complications he raises with the idea of inherent value is to say that one strategy to extending some sense of inherent value to, or intrinsic value to, part of nature is to notice that animals have sentience. They have some kind of consciousness or awareness. They experience pain and suffering. And so that's one way we might think, well, we have obligations to animals. We have obligations to dogs and cats and sheep and cows and so on. The problem with this is that it does not extend to plants and inanimate objects, right? So this would fall short of telling us why we should preserve the rainforest, or why we should take care of the ocean, or why we should preserve a mountainside, this kind of stuff, right? It also falls short when we talk about things like preserving the ecosystem, overall systems, or species, right? Because an individual member of a species is different than a species as a whole. Also, preservation in general does not usually deal with individuals, right? We're talking about systems, we're talking about species. When we talk about preservation efforts, we're talking about preserving a forest. The idea of sentience and suffering is going to be a problem to try to justify those kinds of preservation efforts. He discusses in the selection that we read two main arguments that he thinks are kind of problematic and are popular that people use in order to try to justify preservation efforts. One is what he calls the ignorance argument. And this is the idea that we should preserve some species or feature of nature based on the fact that we don't know what will happen if it's gone. Right, if we don't preserve it, right? This is somewhat akin to the butterfly effect kind of idea, that if we don't preserve this particular species, we don't know what kind of impact it will have on the ecosystem. The first thing that Sober mentions is that this is inconsistent in the sense that it places value on some feature of nature based on the fact that we don't know if it has value, right? And he thinks that's obvious, a kind of contradiction in terms. Second, he mentions the probability issue, which is that we're making decisions that are based on the mere possibility that something bad might happen, with oftentimes with very, very little concrete evidence or real indication, strong indication that it will happen. Third, he mentions that the ignorance argument includes ignorance of benefits. Right, so maybe letting some species die off will actually improve the environment or help the ecosystem and balance it in some way. And we don't know that because we don't know what will happen, good or bad. And so we need to take into consideration ignorance of the good as well as the bad. The fourth point he mentions is what he calls a hasty generalization, and this actually extends kind of to the next argument. This is the idea is just because we think that some species plays a crucial role in balancing the ecosystem, it doesn't follow that all species play a crucial role. So just because we think that preserving one kind of insect or something like this is really, really important, like let's say bees, right? It doesn't follow that we should, preserve, gray squirrels or something like this. Just because one is shown to be part or an important part of the ecosystem, it doesn't follow that all species are like this, right? So the second argument that he considers is the slippery slope argument. And this is the idea that we think that the extinction of any species kind of will impoverish the biosphere or the ecosystem. And so all species need to be preserved, right? And so he mentions that there are lots and lots of species, right? I think he gives a number of 8.7 million species on Earth. I think it's actually more now. I think it's closer to 10. Presumably, the loss of one will impact the biosphere only slightly. That just makes sense in terms of numbers, right? And so the stakes don't seem particularly high to make major efforts to preserve any particular species, right? And just because we don't preserve one species doesn't mean that we won't preserve others, right? The idea of a slippery slope argument is that once we say it's okay to let one species die off and we don't make preservation efforts, the idea is that we will continue to do that for more and more and more species. That is the idea of slippery slope argument in general, right? Take one step down the slope and then you'll fall all the way down. And Sober thinks this kind of slippery slope argument is oftentimes made for the idea of preserving species, that we need to preserve every single species because letting one go means that we're going to let the whole ecosystem fall apart. These are a couple of obstacles, concerns about what it is to try to think about our ethical obligations towards nature. And so the duration of the course will really be looking at different strategies and efforts to attempt to justify the sensibility that we have that nature is in some sense valuable and that we do have some kind of firm obligation to respect nature. That's it for today. Thanks for watching.